Poverty has been a topic discussed for generations, and even experts today cannot agree upon one clear definition of poverty. After looking up the definition of poverty online, we found that poverty is defined as the state of being extremely poor. Obviously, this definition does not encompass all the different facets of poverty, so we will be answering the question of what is poverty and how do we measure it.
Poverty is having an income level that restricts a person from certain capabilities required to live a fulfilling life, considering the social circumstances of one's environment. To measure poverty, it is important to consider income level, including in-kind benefits, medical out-of-pocket expenses, also known as MOOP, work-related expenses, and childcare expenses, as well as life expectancy rates, crime rates, mean years of schooling, literacy rates, mental health self-examinations, employment rates, voting rates, group identification surveys, and housing rates.
It is important to consider one's income level since we buy the majority of our necessities and certain capabilities through income. Therefore, one's poverty status is affected by their income. We decided to consider all factors that may affect one's income level, similar to the SPM, because income alone does not determine whether a person is impoverished or not. This is one of the major flaws of the OPM. We specifically will look at in-kind benefits, which are forms of non-monetary income that help one afford what one needs. Examples of in-kind benefits are EITC, or Earned Income Tax Credit, SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, Social Security, and government subsidies. Additionally, we will consider taxes, medical out-of-pocket expenses, or MOOP, work-related expenses such as transportation to one's job, and childcare costs.
Within our definition, we state that it is important to consider the social circumstances of one's environment. One of these social circumstances includes intergenerational mobility, which explains the differences in status and income levels between different generations of families. Janty created an earnings mobility matrix to compare the financial status of fathers and their sons, and he found that the main diagonals tend to have the highest numbers. That is, sons are most likely to end up in the same group as their fathers. Intergenerational mobility describes how people born into wealthier families are more likely to be wealthy, while those born into poor families are more likely to be impoverished. People born into wealthier families receive certain opportunities that people born into poor families do not receive, which is why there is such a strong correlation between a person's upbringing and their future financial prospects. Other poverty measures, such as the OPM, SPM, and HCI, do not consider intergenerational mobility. However, because a significant number of around 42.2% of sons with a father in the lowest earning quintile will also end up in the same quintile, we decided that this is a very important issue that needs to be considered.
When creating this definition, the first aspect that we considered was whether or not to make it a relative or absolute measure. A relative measure of poverty considers others within a community, whereas an absolute measure of poverty bases poverty on a fixed matter without considering others. We decided upon a quasi-relative measure because we wanted to consider a person's position within society, but we recognized the issues of having a 100% relative poverty measure. Within a wealthy community, there may be a very limited number of people who fall below the absolute poverty measure, but if a relative measure is used, a larger number of people would be considered impoverished, even though their well-being may be better than those living in a poorer community. For example, according to economist Tim Worstall, if one were to look at China's poverty level today in comparison to the 1960s from a relative measure of poverty, it would have doubled. However, China has experienced one of the largest declines in material poverty in human history since the 1960s. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, during the last 3 decades, the share of Chinese living in absolute poverty dramatically declined from 8 in 10 to 1 in 10. This change goes completely unnoticed if one only focuses on a relative poverty measure. Within our definition, we consider poverty as being unable to live a fulfilling life, which is shaped by the typical needs and desires of one's society. An absolute measure of poverty does not consider one's environmental or social needs, which is very important since our minimum standards of living are shaped by what is around us. This is described by Amartya Sen. The capability approach has indeed been used, for example in Sen 1983C, 1984, to argue that while the commodity requirements of such capabilities, as being able to take part in the life of the community, or being able to appear in public without shame, vary greatly from one community to another, thereby giving the poverty line a relativist character in the space of commodities, there is much less variation in the capabilities that are aimed at through the use of these commodities.
Nussbaum's capability approach inspired the foundation for our poverty measure. Capabilities are all the opportunities a person potentially has the ability to take advantage of. Poverty can be seen as a lack of capabilities. Thus, the elimination of poverty would focus on expanding opportunities and choices. Nussbaum writes how it is important to look at various capabilities, not just one. As she states, I typically use the plural, capabilities, in order to emphasize that the most important elements of people's quality of life are plural and qualitatively distinct. Health, bodily integrity, education, and other aspects of individual lives cannot be reduced to a single metric without distortion. The capabilities we will consider within our definition of poverty are health, security, education, social integration, and control over one's environment. In order to build an effective poverty measure, we chose to use proxies to measure the certain capabilities we found important. Proxies are the best way to measure capabilities quantitatively. Within the capability of health, we will be considering both mental and physical health by using the proxies of life expectancy rates and mental health self-examinations. Health is an important capability to consider because humans deserve the right to live freely without their life ending prematurely. For the capability of security, we will consider crime rates within one's community in order to ensure a person feels comfortable within their society and is able to live without the constant fear of harmful situations. When considering the capability of education, we believe everyone deserves the right to education if they desire this, so we examine both literacy rates and mean years of schooling. Social integration is another important capability to consider because one's quality of life is typically determined by the lives of those surrounding them. So we use the proxies of employment rates and group identification surveys in order to determine whether a person feels socially integrated in their community. The final capability we consider important is control over one's environment, which is one of Nussbaum's 10 capabilities. This encompasses one's ability to have certain rights, such as the ability to participate politically and own property, so we will measure this with the proxies of voting rates and housing rates. The OPM and SPM do not consider capabilities, which means they fail to consider certain opportunities necessary for one to live a fulfilling life, such as social integration and education. According to Sen, the conversion of income into basic capabilities may vary greatly between individuals and also between different societies, so that the ability to reach minimally acceptable levels of basic capabilities can go with varying levels of minimally adequate incomes. Income is important to consider, however, basic capabilities are another necessary factor to consider when determining if someone is impoverished. Although the HCI considers capabilities, they only consider life expectancy, education, and gross national income. We believe that security, social integration, and control over one's environment should be examined as well because we define poverty as a quasi-relative measure that considers environmental factors within each specific community, which the HCI fails to do.
Poverty is a very complex, multifaceted issue that is difficult to define and measure. Our definition encompasses factors from many different poverty measures, including the OPM, the SPM, and HDI. We define poverty from a capability standpoint that considers intergenerational mobility and income levels using a quasi-relative measure and proxies. A more comprehensive measure of poverty, such as the one we propose, could lead to more effective policies to help reduce poverty in the world. However, the viability and the amount of work required to create an effective, holistic measure are barriers at the moment. Today, we look to Google to answer all of our questions, but the truth is, poverty is much too complex for Google.